Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I will continue the series on the modern defense with the 3 pawns attack, which is one of the rare continuations for white, but one of the very aggressive setups which could lead to problems for black. And it's similar to the Austrian attack in the Pierce defense, where white also continues with pawn to f4, pushing his third pawn into the center. The difference is, the main difference between the Pierce and the modern, anyway, is that the knight isn't on f6, so we are going to talk about some differences there. So after the move e4, black goes for the modern defense, pawn to g6, white takes up the center, and if you haven't seen the introductory video on the modern, please do. There I try to explain all the basics of the opening and main ideas for white and for black. But basically what white is doing, he is accepting the broad center black is giving to him by playing in hyper-modern fashion. So black wants to fianchetto his bishop, castle his king, break open the center later with the move pawn to c5, and white obliges, takes up the center. So black continues with pawn to g7, and now we are going to look at the 3 pawns attack, which is pawn to f4. Pawn to f4 is a very aggressive move, which gives white flexibility in his position and which gives white many more options in the attack than black does have. And f4 is preparing either to play the move f5, the move e5, or the move d5, with the center being supported much more now that the pawn is on f4. Especially in the cases where white pushes e5, you can see that the pawn is reinforced. And here we are going to talk about 4 moves for black. It might be surprising, but all 4 of them are playable, and all 4 of them are, okay for black. I think white is slightly better in every variation, but all 4 moves are playable. And these moves are d5, d6, c5, and c6. There are no other moves black could play. Black basically has to react as soon as possible. If you think about black's setup and what he would like to achieve, he would like to castle his king, therefore he has to move the knight. So in order to castle, he would either have to play knight to h6 or knight to f6. If knight to f6 is played, then e5 immediately is better for white. And if knight to h6 is played, which is often played afterwards, then black doesn't have that much time to open up the center later on. So black has to play one of the 4 moves. The first move we are going to look at is the move d6, which is by far the most popular continuation. It does, however, in most cases lead out of the modern and into the Pierce. And very often this position is going to transpose to the Austrian attack in the Pierce defense, where black plays the same move, the move pawn to d6, with his knight being on f6 and the white knight being on c3, defending the e4 pawn. So the normal continuation for white here is knight to f3. Black continues with knight to f6, and now if white continues with knight to c3, we have entered the Austrian attack. Let me just show you that position here. So e4, pawn to d6, the Pierce defense, d4, knight to f6, knight to c3, defending the e4 pawn, g6, f4, the Austrian attack, bishop to g7, and knight to f3. This is now the same position. So we have entered the same position that we have here. So this is the Pierce defense by transposition. And we don't really want to do that with black, because if you play the modern defense, then you probably want to play the modern defense, and the Pierce is quite different. If you haven't seen the video on the Austrian attack in the Pierce, please do. It's recorded on the channel. So we are going to explain the other move black can play to avoid transposing to the Pierce. After the move f4, the 3 pawns attack, d6, knight to f3, black doesn't have to play knight to f6 entering the Pierce. Black can play the move c5, and c5 is the most thematic move in the modern defense and the move which you are always going to want to play, and c5 is your main break in the position. White now has 2 options. By far the better option is to push the pawn forward to d5 and not take. If white takes, then a simple queen check is going to win the pawn back, and white is going to have less control in the center with only these 2 pawns, missing his d4 pawn. So after c5, the best move for white is to play d5. And now, after the move knight to f6, this is also a variation of the Austrian attack in the Pierce, but slightly different, and black has already broken in the center. So this would be slightly favorable. But remember that In every variation after pawn to d6, it's highly likely that you will transpose into the Pierce defense if both players play correctly into the Austrian attack, so I'm not going to talk about this move much longer. One key thing that you should remember is that after knight to f6, knight c3 castles, bishop d3, e6 castles. Black's main idea after bishop to d3 is to try to open up the center with the move e6. Now there are no more breaks, and after the move pawn to e6, castles, e takes d, this is what I was talking about in the introductory video. Very often in the modern defense, black is going to have to concede to having a Benoni pawn structure. What does a Benoni pawn structure mean? It means that you have a bad backwards pawn on d6, and this is going to be the Benoni weakness, and white can easily surround his play around winning this pawn. So a common Benoni maneuver would be knight from f3 to d2, knight to c4, putting pressure on the pawn. A move such as f5, bishop to f4, putting pressure on the pawn. A move such as knight to b5, putting pressure on the pawn. And indeed, these two maneuvers could be quite enough to win the pawn. So black is going to have to be extra careful. After the move bishop to d3, if you don't play e6, then you can't break open the center, and if you do play e6, then you have nothing better to do but to enter the Benoni pawn structure, so be careful about this. That's why I would recommend after f4, the 3 pawns attack, that you don't play the move d6, because either way you are going to have a downside in your position, which is going to be significant. The next move I wanted to talk about is the move d5, slightly more aggressive, but leading to a bad position for black for a different reason. Now, the engines think that this position is almost equal. They always like white slightly because of the space advantage, but I think that the move d5 is, well, it gives white quite an easy game. So after d5, there's nothing better for white to do than to continue with e5, the very logical move. And same as in the Pierce defense, what you want to do, you want to block out this bishop from the diagonal and kill black's main weapon. Now in hypermodern openings such as the King's Indian or the Benoni or the modern or the Pierce, your bishop on g7 is your main attacking weapon, and if you get that dampened, then your position is going to be less good. Here black has two options. He can either play h5, knight h6, or simply knight h6. What's clear is that you have to develop your bishop. At some point later on in the game, you might want to play the move e6, but not here yet, because your bishop is blocked in then, so it's going to be tougher to develop. You want to play bishop to g4 first. So basically what black wants to do is wait for the move knight to f3, pin the knight, then play e6. But in the meantime, black will have to develop the knight and castle anyway, so the move knight to h6 is a very logical choice. The second most popular move is h5, and then after knight to f3, knight to h6 here. Looking at this square, but whether this pawn is better on h7 or on h5 is arguable. I actually prefer it on h7 because I don't think it's as much of a liability, and you give white a clear option to play h3, g4, undermine that structure. So I would recommend that after the move e5, you simply play knight to h6, knight f3, castles, bishop to e2, bishop to g4. And now you are free to play the move e6 whenever you want, without your bishop being locked in on c8. Knight to a3 is a common plan for white. Why knight a3? Even though c3 or d2 might seem like better options, what you want to do is put the brakes on c5, and since you can't stop black from playing that, you want to be able to play the move c3. So knight to c3 is not an option. Why you play knight to a3 is that because after c3 you can play knight to c2 and transfer your knight into e3, where it's going to be a very strong attacking piece, especially after the move c5. This pawn is going to be weakened, and you're going to be able to exert a lot of pressure on black's position. The second thing is that once you get your knight from c2 to e3, you are looking at the f5 square, where the h6 knight clearly wants to enter, so you are challenging black's idea. Knight f5, castles, knight to d7, c3, e6, what we discussed, knight c2, c5, this is why you played c3, dc5, knight takes, and now you are able to play knight to d4 or knight to e3. Knight to e3 is a better option, challenging the f5 knight, by far black's strongest piece. And even though the engines think this is almost equal, slightly better for white, from a human perspective, it's very easy to play because you are playing against one black piece, and that's the g7 bishop. And if you can manage to keep this bishop locked out of the game for the next 10 or 20 moves, then white is going to win. And it's fairly easy to see that white's pieces are much more active. So that's for the move d5. You have to concede to this, your bishop being bad, and then you need to open it up later on if you manage. And you need to remember that your knight goes to h6 and then to f5, which might not be as good. I mean, it's very hard to play for black, and that's why the move d5 shouldn't be your first option either. One more sideline I would like to mention is the move c6, which isn't that challenging for white either. White simply continues with knight to f3, now d5, c3 is reinforcing d5, but white plays c5 anyway, and now you've just taken up a square for your knight on c6, and I mean, there's not too much difference from the position we've seen last. Once again, knight h6 or h5. h5 is preferred move by grandmasters here. h5, bishop d3, knight h6, castles. You basically have the same issues. You are going to want to play bishop g4 and e6, and white is going to white doesn't have to play c3 here because c6, c5 would be loss of tempo. But it might not be a bad idea to get your knight to e3 anyway, challenging the f5 square. So c6 I really don't like. And the best move for black, which I believe is challenging for white, is the move c5. And c5 is a very aggressive move, challenging white's center immediately. If white captures, then of course queen check and winning the pawn once again, so you can't really win a pawn. You can play e5, but that's not as good. You will be weakening your center. And the best move is d5 for white. And after the move d5, you can see the main upside for black in this variation. This bishop is alive, and if you can get this bishop to be active, then you definitely achieved something. Compared to the last three variations where the bishop wasn't that strong, I think that this one is much better. The main downside of the move c5, which you are going to see shortly, is that once again, after the move d6, you're going to have to play the move e6 at some point and enter the Benoni pawn structure. And you're going to have similar problems to the d6 variation. Knight f3, knight f6, this is now very similar to the variation that we saw with d6. In fact, it's a transposition. And now after knight c3 castles, bishop d3, e6, white can either castle, which is considered slightly worse, or white can take on e6, bishop takes e6 and castle now, and here you have it, the weakness on d6, which can easily be exploited. The advantage of castling instead of taking on after e6 instead of taking on e6 is that black is going to take here and you are going to fix the pawn on d6, so if you don't castle then black has to take, if you castle then black has to take, e takes d5, and after e takes d5 you now have the Benoni weakness to exploit once again. So let's repeat. Knight to b5 attacking the pawn, knight to d2, knight to c4 attacking the pawn, attacking moves such as f5 breaking up black's position, and you are strategically better. The engines will tell you that black is better in this position. The engines much prefer after e6 taking on e6, but I think for humans it's easier to castle and to allow this. So in any case, I wanted to show you this variation first to start off the in-depth videos on the modern, because I think that it's really hard for the modern defense player to fight against the three pawns variation. A simple move such as e4, g6, d4, bishop g7, f4, with the absence of the knight on f6, actually changes the position a lot, and if you don't transpose to the Austrian attack, black is going to have to concede to a Benoni pawn structure or a dead bishop, which are two downsides which are major. And I think that if you go into the opening knowing that your position is going to be better because your opponent is either going to have a bad bishop on g7 or a weak pawn on d6, you are starting the opening with an advantage on move 1. Yeah, I think the three pawns attack is a wonderful way to fight the modern, and I would advise the players with the black pieces to find something. And once again, I would recommend the move c5, firstly because it's the most energetic way to play. Your bishop is alive and the engines think you're better, so you definitely stand a chance. But try to yeah, try to go in depth on the move c5 if you are black. I think this is the only worthy option, and try to find deadly things to stop white. Okay, everybody, thanks very much for watching. I hope you liked this video on the 3 pawns attack in the modern defense. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you've used it or if you plan to use it. And stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye.